Hi, welcome to podcast of Voices of Home. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sherri Brown. I'm a licensed independent clinical social worker, and I work at Northfield Mount Hermon as a mental health counselor.
Our social enterprise is focusing on domestic violence and family homelessness. So we just want to learn from you about the psychological mental status of people of their pre-homelessness stage of their life. So as far as we know, approximately about 21% of individuals are experiencing homelessness in the US and have a very serious mental health condition. And so we just want to learn about your perspective on that. What's your general understanding of their life experiences and the hardship they're going through?
I think that it's a pretty nuanced and complicated situation for a lot of people, and that folks who end up houseless, and I do think that the community at large tends to use the word houseless instead of homeless, because they create home communities even without a home structure. And so I think that that's also important to name. Domestic violence, are you looking at domestic violence in particular?
Yeah.
Okay. And so domestic violence is really about power and control, and it doesn't mean a relationship is all good or all bad. And folks that are finding themselves experiencing violence in the home, it often, the precursors to things that are happening are stressors in the environment. Sometimes that's financial stress, people losing their job, relationship stress that's going on, where there's perhaps some jealousy and controlling behavior or abusive behavior in a relationship, but that can be separate from crises that happen where people's stability and sense of self get taken away. Mm-hmm. And so when someone's sense of self and access to basic care can lead to spikes in domestic violence, right? That is what we do know a little bit about. And so when families are experiencing financial crisis, job insecurity, and lack of access to healthcare and mental health care, it can add a lot of stressors that lead to eruptions in violent cycles. And then beyond that, I think that there's also some houseless folks who have experienced incredible amounts of trauma. We see a lot of veterans that are houseless. We also know that folks who can't access regular and consistent mental health care for persistent and ongoing chronic mental health conditions can also end up on the streets a lot, because accessing medication that is affirming and helpful for them to stay stable is not possible. And then if you're off your medication, it's hard to maintain a job, and it's hard to maintain the ways that you need to, the things that you need to do in order to keep a home, right? And so really this is also about systems that aren't working, right? We're not supporting folks to have stable and secure housing. We're not supporting folks in having stable and secure mental health treatment. We're not supporting families around how to parent. Parenting is hard, right? And so it, all of a sudden your life is kind of usurped by children who don't have the ability to control their emotions because they're growing and their prefrontal cortex aren't formed altogether. And so you might be dealing with emotionally dysregulated children and financial stress and not know how to have enough food to feed them, right? And so all of these things impact people's mental health, but also it's really just your access to care. We're not a country that has universal housing. We don't have a universal wage, right? And so people really are struggling under the oppression of capitalism and white supremacy, and that all impacts things.
On the topic of families and children, what elements in family settings and environment are kind of needed to help a child thrive in their life? What stability is needed?
Yeah, well, access to basic care, right? So having a stable and secure house or housing environment, having kind of consistent caregivers, whether that means parents of origin or birth parents or not, having a consistent adult presence is also really helpful in terms of forming attachment for young people and creating their mental health to grow in resiliency, because that's how, when you're really little, you learn from relationships. You learn about the world through relationships. And so if families are stressed about providing care or childcare or food or housing, they're also not going to be able to emotionally attune to the needs of their kids as well, right? And so it's all impacted by each other. So kids need secure attachment, they need access to food, water, safety, medical care, but also they need emotional attunement, right? And they need someone to be able to like tolerate their big feelings when they're having them in a way that doesn't make them feel shamed or bad for having them, because then that helps them develop a sense of resiliency and a sense of self.
So we know that around like 20 to like 57% of homeless women report that domestic abuse was like the root cause of their homelessness. So as you just said, like parenting is like a really important part of like a child's thriving process. So like I'm just curious, like how does like domestic abuse to women impacted like their total like parenting like experience?
Well, it absolutely impacts your parenting experience. I also think it impacts the children. Like if they're experiencing developmental domestic violence and harm, clearly that's a trauma. But also if they're witnessing emotional, physical, or verbal abuse of their parent by another caregiver, that's incredibly confusing for a young person, right? So like they're safe people are their parents, but their safe people aren't safe with each other, or one of their safe people isn't being safe with one of their parents, and that creates an incredible amount of conflict for them internally and psychically and emotionally.
Do you think that's kind of why, like, children who had parents who were domestically abused or just abused in general have a tendency to do the same with their partners? Do you think that's like a connecting factor or not?
It can be. I think that statistic isn't as clear. It can be that people are accustomed to seeing kind of like people sacrificing their own needs in the context of a relationship. It's also about mirroring, right? Like what have you seen as a model for what you've seen of how you navigate conflict? How do you navigate boundaries? How do you navigate keeping yourself safe? And like if your models for that haven't been about you feeling safe in your life, that's going to be really hard for you to navigate your own relationships. And it may not mean that you then go perpetrate domestic violence, but it may mean that you also have a hard time sticking up for yourself in relationships. It might mean that like you seek out people that you want to quote unquote fix, or like who have crises of their own because you've existed in an adrenaline filled environment all the time. Your nervous system on a scientific level is then used to crisis as a baseline. And so actually sometimes when you're in a quote like a safer or more secure relationship, you feel unsafe because you're not used to the way that your nervous system feels when it's regulated. You're used to your nervous system being on like hypervigilant adrenaline mode, right? And so it could also impact their relationships in the sense that all of a sudden they feel bored or unsafe in an actual secure, healthy relationship.
Yeah, so like how does that like feeling of insecurity impact children's develop during their puberty? How would that go?
Well, I think similarly, like puberty is such a huge time where your body is changing, but also your brain is like going through an incredible amount of change, and you're pruning your synapses to decide what's important and what's not important, right? And so if you've grown up with a tunnel vision of like kind of what being safe means or not safe means, then your brain is going to be wired in that way. And our brains have a lot of neuroplasticity, so I'm not saying that like your brain is permanently like wired for whatever function, but that like it does set you up to kind of have a little bit more difficulty around being able to regulate. And puberty, I also think is just really hard on parents.
Right, yeah.
So it's just like another high time of stress because it's super normal for kids to be like, I hate you. Yeah. And like, I don't want to do that. And like all of those things, right? Like to push against your authority figures is your job in puberty. If your caregivers don't have all of their capacity because of their stressors and they don't have enough money to get food on the table or housing's insecure, imagine what that's like, right? Like all of a sudden you're supposed to be patient with a kid who's like, fuck you. So it's really difficult for parents to also have emotional regulation to manage puberty. And so it can be a time of stress for all families, whether they're housing insecure or not. But yeah, and then the teenager is also like figuring out like, how do I tell someone that I like who I like, have crush on, or what does it mean if someone has a crush on me, or like all those things. So it can bring up trauma stuff too.
Yeah. So it says here that around 1.37 million students were identified as homeless, which is a 14% increase from the year 2021 to 2022. Which means that most homeless students or people who are facing homelessness or houselessness, I'm losing my train of thought here, but my question kind of surrounds like the idea of like, how does houselessness impact children's education, if the children is receiving education, and if not, how does not receiving an education from pre-K or high school or middle school impact the children themselves?
Well, I think a lot of students are definitely house insecure, and that generally also means they're food insecure, right? And so a lot of families rely on public education's food programs, right? So like they get breakfast and lunch all year, and then also all of a sudden in the summer that extra food and the assistance is gone because the kid's not in school anymore. And so there's a lot of ways that if you go to school hungry, do you learn well? No. Like if you go to school after your family has been experiencing being in a shelter or a DV incident, like, do you think that they're able to concentrate the next day? No. Like, so like we can't learn unless we feel a level of safety, right? And so even we know that, like, as you're learning, right? Like there's like you want to be pushed out of your comfort zone enough that you're challenged, but if you're pushed too far out of your comfort zone, your body shuts down and your brain shuts down because it wants to protect you. It feels unsafe. And so if a student is kind of like feeling like in their nervous system emotionally unsafe all the time because of the circumstances that they're coming from when they get to school, then they're not going to be able to access their learning the way that students who have food and house and safety in their homes are.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a cycle where like children who grew up houseless can't really get a great education in like middle school, high school, and then don't really go to college or not a great college, and then have a hard time finding a job. So that's kind of
or they don't have the support
Yeah.
to like help them facilitate those things in their lives, right? But it also doesn't mean that that's necessarily going to be a cycle that they fall into, but it does mean that like they weren't given the privilege of like having those things secure for them so that they could show up and learn without those obstacles.
So what do you think it's like I don't know how to frame that question, but like what was like the difference of being houseless as like a family unit or like an individual? Like what do you think it's like the difference in that?
Well, I think it's really difficult to find family shelters, and so there's just not as much access to like safety, and I think that's part of the reason it's not the only reason, but it's part of the reason why it's hard to leave a violent relationship if you want to and you have kids and you don't know where to go, and like or there's no room in the shelter, or a lot of programs are creating houses for families in that situation, but not enough, right? And so I kind of lost your question.
Yeah, like, because I just want to know, like, how, like, what more, like, what's the, like the difference of, like, the obstacles that a family unit has to face.
Versus an individual. Yeah, I mean, I think there's also a lot of fear around providing care for your kid, because there's also systems that are, like, child welfare systems that are meant to, like, be supportive, but sometimes are actually oppressive or kind of like separating families in circumstances that aren't always the best case scenario, right? And so if someone really can't provide secure housing, even in a shelter, or food regularly, like they also run the risk of someone like filing on them at the Department of Children and Families, and like then having a social worker investigate them and see whether or not so I think that the fear for families versus single houseless people are that they also are trying to care for their kids and keep their kids in their care, literally, and they're worried about their kids having to be separated from each other and going to foster care or separated from their parents because of the circumstances they're in. And so there's that fear, right? Like, can I keep my family together? Let alone also, can I keep my family safe and feed them?
Yeah.
I think I want to kind of end this with like, since we think like domestic violence is like an important part that causing people to be like houselessness or
Yeah, domestic violence
and then like
mental health.
yeah, how do you think we should deal with that, or like how does the family can deal with that if like the situation is they can feel like the situation is like coming to them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, on a base level, like accessing resources, there are resources, like pretty great resources, particularly in Massachusetts, and Western Mass has several DV shelters, DV lines that can hook you up with therapy and family advocacy centers and family shelters. Like there is that, at least here, probably not enough beds. But so getting resources, getting mental health support would be, I think, really helpful. But also, I think, again, when you're thinking about like transformative justice, right? Like you're thinking about like how does this issue, this conflict or this issue come up, and like what are the things in the society that led to this being possible, right? And so the real prevention is actually about society and our systems changing and our systems creating support and true support for people and true accessibility to services and medication and trauma-informed care for veterans or people who've been through DV, and also our system gaining more willingness, expansion, ability, capacity to hold people who have been through trauma, right? And not expect everyone to be behaving and existing and learning in all the same ways. So we need like learning environments that are more flexible and housing environments that are more flexible. And so really, I think the prevention really lies not on the individual families, but really on our system of care and whether or not we're really going to support our communities and support through mutual aid, like the people that need support the most.
Yeah, and I think that point is thoroughly backed up because Franklin County is is the poorest county in Massachusetts. And studies also find that Franklin County's houselessness population is on the rise as well. So I think there is a correlation with how much money or support is in a place to the houselessness population.
Yeah, and also we haven't talked about this too much, but like the overlap between like the opioid crisis and addiction and mental health and houselessness is also pretty significant.
Yeah.
And so also if we're not providing harm reduction services to people who are addicted to opioids or other drugs, then we're also setting them up to not get support, right? Like if it's an all or nothing, that isn't actually going to help someone.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for
welcome.
this podcast. And thank you to whoever's listening to the Voices of Home podcast. See you next time. Bye.